Hello there, my name's Phil Williams and I would like to welcome you to Audio Angling, the podcast site of fishingfilmsandfacts.co.uk. Besides working on the weekly publication Carp World and being an acknowledged expert in his own right on the subject of surface fishing for carp, Chris Ball is also a respected carp historian, and it's this particular thread of his enthusiasm for the species that we're going to explore here, spanning the gap between their initial introduction to the country right through to Richard Walker and his 44-pound Redmore record Clarissa. An area of fishing which, while it's of great interest to most carp enthusiasts, is not something too many become actively involved in researching, preferring to leave it to others. So as one of those others, it's now down to you to give us the guided tour.
Now, a big part of it all in this whole gambit of carp fishing, where I found myself in a niche market, besides the floater fishing thing, is writing about the history of it. And in Carp World, which was in 1988 the first newsstand carp-only magazine in the world, started, and I was in issue number 1, writing about history of carp fishing. They recently, last year, had the 250th edition, and I was in that one. Here we are, some of the ones. I managed to get my picture on the cover of that one. It's a new book by me called Best of the Famous Catches, and this is enlarged versions, or rewritten new pictures, versions of some of the stories that I've written about in Carp World over the years. I write on a weekly website which comes out today on the Cemex site. I've done for a number of years, called The Special Album, and I relate once a week a picture and a story. So to give you an idea, this site, which is one of the most popular sites by far, there's been over 202,000 hits, including over 1,000 replies. Here's my offering today. And so each week, there we are, just a little bit. It's about Jack Hilton, this one today, which I posted at 9 minutes. And I'm sure, it doesn't get any better than that. We're over 102 pages. So I produced, and this has got an unbelievable following. I really can't believe it myself. And there's, other than Kevin Clifford, my business partner, though he doesn't write on a regular basis, he's produced sort of groundbreaking books on the subject. But on a day-to-day, there's nobody in the UK except me that's sort of writing about stuff like that. And I'm glad to say that there is a strong interest in where it's all come from. And it's the journey, not just the size of the fish in the end. It's, obviously, every picture tells a story. But yeah, so this is a latest one that's just come out, and we produced this. This is our company, Carp Fishing News. It was launched at the Carping On show, which is another thing I'm involved with, which is the big carp show of the year, which takes place every March, and it was launched there. And can you believe it, by about 1 o'clock on the Sunday, 2-day show, we ran out of hardback, so we had to get some more done. But yeah, I'm showing the front cover here. There's 20 stories in here, and virtually every one of those people depicted on there I have sat down at some stage or other in the last 40 years and talked about their catches. Very kindly given me pictures when I've requested them and what have you. So some of them are sort of first-hand sort of stories that I got from people. So that is a big thing, which gives me an insight into a little bit, and Kevin Clifford certainly a lot more, into how the hell did this all happen?
Which begs the question, when did carp first arrive in Britain and how did they get here?
Right, well, though it's still largely unclear, as a general answer to when, they were certainly here in the 12th and 13th century, a long, long time ago. The monastic monks, certainly in around the 16th century, had carp in the famous stew ponds. This was no meat on Friday, of course, and fish was an alternative, not necessarily a sea fish. In the 1600s, you can imagine the road networks in this country from the shore around the islands was pretty dire, I should think. So to breed and propagate freshwater fish and carp was one of the ones that they did. One of the really interesting developments sort of around that time, 16th, 17th, 18th century, is that there was individuals in the UK that did land, people had estates, created artificial fish ponds as part of the wealth of the property. But some of these people started to import from mainly Germany a carp called a Spiegelkarpfen. And Spiegel is the German word for mirror image. And these were the cultivated king carp strain. These have been manufactured by the hand of man, and that has produced selective breeding, not only in the growth, but in the structure of the fish itself, the way it looks, and obviously its scaling pattern as well. And these emanated from, I guess, what would be now classed as the old Eastern Bloc countries. Poland, Germany, Bohemia, Czechoslovakia were heavily into carp as a major food source, thousands of tons harvested every year. We're left with the legacy today of the German national Christmas dish is still a boiled, steamed, baked carp of some description. It is a major food all around sort of Ukraine and goodness knows where else, where it is just an everyday consumable fish. When the change happened in the UK from it becoming a food source to a sporting species is again largely unclear, but the availability of the selectively bred king carp into the UK can be traced back to certainly the 1800s, and in fact places, for instance, I've just got a note here that the Thames was stocked with king carp in 1895. 400 of them were released into the Thames. That's a notable sort of stockings. And there was one company in the UK called the Manor Fisheries, operated by Thomas Ford in Lincolnshire, that had ties with a Dutch company that were producing in quantity small carp, selectively bred king carp. And he started to import them into the UK for sale for angling purposes. They were deemed to be, obviously grew to a great size, over £10 in a lot of places. They were stern fighters. They were difficult to catch on purpose. Virtually nobody then concentrated purely on carp. They were only landed through accidental capture. People, I don't know, fishing for roach, fishing for anything other than carp. In the main, they got busted up, and tremendous stories of monsters lost and battles and all the rest of it. And occasionally one would be landed, and the monster turned out to be an 8-pounder. But if you're catching 4-ounce roach, an 8-pounder it really is a monster. So Thomas Ford was very important in the late 1800s for starting to import king carp. Now, the business arrangement that he struck up was with an incredible company in Holland. It's Nederlander Heidemashi. So how about that? And I'll tell you later how to spell that. They were a reclamation land company that dealt with everything to do with agriculture. They had a peat side that dug just peat. They had arborist side. They had to do with forestry commissions. They also bred fish. And in the main, they bred carp. There was no selective breeding of carp in Holland. They were bought in from outside and propagated from just a few fish to a massive company that Heidemashi sort of grew into. Now, Thomas Ford died in the early 1900s, and in 1907 his manor farm, Fisheries, was sold to the Surrey Trout Farm. This is our connection with Donald Leaney, because Donald Leaney in the mid-1920s joined the company. They were involved at that time, as the name suggests, because it was the Surrey Trout Farm, breeders and suppliers of trout throughout the country. He did a little bit of business abroad, but mainly in the UK. He saw an opportunity after the war, after the 1418 war, when Donald became involved with the company, of renewing the existing lines of contact that Thomas Ford had opened with the Haida-Mashi, and he resumed the business of selecting every autumn carp from the ponds over in Vassen in northern Holland, his supplies for the year, and he would bring them in through the boat and railway network, and they would end up at Hazelmere, which is just on the fringes of Surrey and Hampshire. And the holding ponds there they were sold and distributed throughout the country. Some of the most famous carp waters that have been created in this country were from fish from Donald Leaney, which included Redmore, Billin, Frensham, and these Galatian, these fantastic fish that I've already explained. They all came in as small fish. They were all stocked in. He bought in between the heady years of sort of the late 40s, after the war, after the Second World War, the late 40s all the way through to the mid 50s, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these small carp were imported by the Surrey Trout Farm. Now, a lot of them went into unsuitable habitats. You had things like inordinate predation, but obviously enough of these fish survived to grow into very big carp and become tales of legend. So from that sort of very quick potted history, we end up with Donald Leaney. The business as such ceased in the 70s. His supply of prime Haida-Mashi carp sort of finished around the mid-50s, but he did supply carp from other places. And then we had carp to come in from Italy, Italian, Belgian carp. We had the incredible Dinkenbluer carp, which is very similar to the Yateley fish, very high back, steep bodies, not very many scales on them. They didn't tend to grow sort of that long compared to the Galatian fish. Just let me explain this, it is important. One of the attributes, besides their lovely coloration and the scaling and all the rest of it that the Galatian carp had, they also had an attribute which through selective breeding had been sort of bred into them, is that they could grow in bone structure for a greater time than almost every other race or strain of carp that were subsequently imported into the UK. For instance, you could quite easily find a Galatian carp could grow in bone structure to its maybe 13th, 14th or even 15th year, whereas the Italians, the Dinkenbluers, all the rest of it, you'd be hard pushed to find past their 10th year. It doesn't mean to say that you won't get a big fish, but often some of these Galatian fish would be approaching 3 foot in length by the time they were fully grown. And dependent on the condition of the fish, the availability of food in the water, you would then get width and depth. I mean, it's little wonder that Redmore produced 3 record carp, Galatian carp, and dominated the list for 28 years. You know, they were all massively long fish that when the food was there, they had rich pickings. Whereas the sort of Dinkenbluer carp or the Italian carps, they could still grow into a big fish, it's just that they became rotund. You get these incredibly, you could get a fish that would have a girth greater than its length. I don't mean really horrible big fat things. I mean, I've got a picture to hand. I mean, there's a very famous fish called shoulders that I managed to catch, and loads of people had caught it over the years, big fish. But I always remember, you know, it had a 29-inch girth and a 28-inch length. It was quite an unusual sort of fish. So the stockings of carp have gone on through people bringing in various races and strains from abroad. In the last 15 years we've had proper homegrown carp, and these days we have a fantastic choice. You've got Viv Shears and you've got Simon Scott of VS Fisheries producing fantastic scaly carp from eggs, selectively breeding, you know, a famous pond like Sutton Carp, a famous little lake in Kent, produced amazing fish. Crossing those was, say, fish from Redmore, the mighty Redmore, getting the best of both worlds. So the VS fisheries, there's Mark Simmons of Heather Fisheries. There's a number of them now, and the last thing we need to do these days is import any carp. So that gives you a sort of how they became spread and the reason why. I've sort of covered that. But I guess obviously then, so we know all about that. How do you catch them? There's people that have angled purposely for carp. They're very few and far between in the early part of the 20th century, and all this came to a head, and people will say, well, inevitably you're going to mention the name Richard Walker, but the fact remains that it did sort of just come to that point in time. In the 30s and 40s, people such as Dennis Watkins Pitchford, whose pseudonym name was that he wrote under BB for many years, a grand old gentleman that I knew and met a number of times, who was a art teacher and also very good at English at rugby. He was a teacher. I forget his actual position and what school it was now. I should know stuff like that. And his children's stories, his stories of the countryside, of foxes, badgers, all the rest of it. Butterflies was another thing of his. But in amongst it, he had an absolute soft spot for carp. And he wrote these amazing books such as Confession of a Carp Fisher, Woodpool, there's numbers of them. Fisherman's Bedside book that's littered with stories of big carp in there. And I mean, this really did get, in some people, the juices flowing. And Richard Walker was given in 1950, I think it was, BB's, let me see, it would have been the Fisherman's Bedside book for a Christmas present from his mother. And in there it had extolled the virtues of been catching big carp, including several accounts of record-breaking carp in there. And Walker wrote to him and said, look, you're saying how difficult they are. Actually, I formulated a few methods and I don't find them that hard to catch because. And so entered a friendship, and which was to bear much fruit. By certainly the early 50s, Walker, well, without a shadow of a doubt, would have caught more £10 carp than any other man alive. I mean, it was into dozens. I think it was well over 80. This has got to be set against the conjecture of most anglers out there probably hadn't seen a 10-pounder in the water, never mind landed one. They were a secretive fish. If they ever hooked one on a maggot, it got bust. Life was too short to contemplate trying to catch a carp. So against that backdrop, Walker in particular, along with a few other people around the country, formed in 1951 an influential organisation called the Carp Catchers Club. And this detailed about a dozen people around the country, and they all pulled their information together. Fortunately, those letters were found about 15 years ago and were produced in letter form in the Carp Catchers Club Letters book, which is a marvellous book which lays the foundation of the habits of the fish, baits to use, times to fish for them, and the whole grounding of how to catch them. Walker in particular had original thoughts. The thing with Walker, I mean, forget the record fish and all the other massive fish he caught, in all kinds of freshwater fishing. He came up with original thoughts. He came up with tackle ideas that, nobody had thought of before. A simple thing, for instance, they're trying to catch big fish, and in a lot of cases, fish that were over 20 pound in weight. The landing nets that were, up until what I think I'm probably right in saying Walker's fish was the first record carp that wasn't killed. They'd either been gaffed, right, because there was no adequate landing nets for them to be landed, and that was just some of the fate that some of those fish had. So Walker came up with a large collapsible triangular landing net that weighed £2 in weight, was 36-inch arms, and can engulf a large pig, never mind a fish. And that formed the basis of, and this was in the early 50s, so 60 years ago, formed the basis of the nets that you see around today. The only thing that's changed, instead of a spreader block, is that there's been a fixed wire, which arms plug into the net, which I suppose is an advancement. But I often say I do a lot of slideshows and stuff like that throughout the country, and sometimes, I've been abroad and done them as well. I do show a picture of taken in Richard Walker's garden in the early 50s of his setup for carp fishing. And I say to people, you just look at this picture here, it's a black and white picture, and nothing's really changed in 60 years. There's a purpose-built carp rod, we've all got one of them. There's a fixable reel, we've all got one of them. There's a bite alarm, it's nowhere near sophisticated, but it makes a buzz and a light goes on. There's a large collapsible landing net, all got one of those. It's not a bed chair, but he's got a rucksack and he's comfortable. Where the quantum leap has happened is in the last foot. Right, so the terminal tackle is like that set up in the early 50s to where carp fishing is now. It's like here and Mars. And I don't just mean the hair rig, I mean all other aspects of rigs and, of course, baits. So, through the Carp Catchers Club and Walker's massive writing output, amazing output, angling times for 30 odd years, he never missed a week. We've all got letters from him, detailed. I don't know where he ever found the time to do all this. It was when you start really looking at his writing output and his letters, certainly the handwritten ones, I've rarely seen anything crossed out. They were just written beautifully. Sadly, I haven't got any of those. All my ones from Dick from the early 70s to around just before he died were all typewritten. It's one of those ones you read things, you just nod your head saying, yeah, of course it is. He's right, he's dead right. Of course he's right, and that's the reason why. His friends, would sometimes be in awe when he seemed to magic fish out of the air, but he often said that there were people around him, not necessarily his close friends, but other, the magical sort of world of fishing that gravitated around a star. To the vast majority of people, they only knew, what he caught, not why and how he caught. They only know that. They don't know the reason behind it. And just to finish on Dick before we go on to the record fish, is that a thing that amazes me, and there's thousands and thousands of specialist big fish anglers in this country, not just carp anglers, and all of us do something that we're not even conscious of doing, that in the early 50s, when Walker came out with these rules on how to change the odds in your favour, find the fish. It sounds a basic thing these days, but as Dick said, it's not the closest place to the car park, or in later times, as I always jokingly say, it's not the spot that's close to the car that's nice and flat. When you look out of the bivvy, all the stainless steel looks wonderful. It's not there. The fish are like 400 yards that way. So find the fish, don't scare them, right? Use a bait they're going to eat. Fish at a time when they're, and the fifth law that I put in is the fish does the rest. I mean, it's never as simple as that fishing, but that kind of philosophy is amazing. And every successful big fish angler in this country adopts that without even thinking about it. And yet, when Walker said it was when people fell on the floor saying, "What are you on about? You fish a lifetime and eventually a glass case specimen will hang itself on the end of your line." And Walker said, well, no, actually, you can change the odds. Of course, he's a great believer in, adequate tackle. People said it was unsporting, £10 line. You know, and there we were fishing heavily weedy waters, sometimes with snags as well, and you're fishing for a big fish, often above 20 pound in weight. So all this went on. In the early 50s, a place came to the notice of certainly Richard Walker, called Redmore Pool, which is near Ross-on-Wye in Herefordshire. This is situated on a farm, Benithan Court Farm, small water. Most people that go there, and a great many carp anglers over the last 60 years, have visited Redmore. And everybody, I was no different when I first went, everybody stands on the dam and looks on it and says, "Isn't it small? How can a place like this can produce 3 record carp?" Dominated the big carp list for nearly 3 decades. And it was found, if you like, in the year before October, or 1951, by a chap that brought it to prominence called Bob Richards, who was interested in carp fishing, and he belonged to the Gloucester Anglers Association. Got talking to a chap and said, "Oh, if you want big carp, you need to go over Rossway and Benithan Court." And he contacted the owner by telephone, said, "Yes, you can come, you know, fishing." And he fished several times during the summer of 1951. Occasionally hooked a big carp, which, I mean, you've got to remember his best carp was maybe about 5 pound at the time. But he saw big ones floating around. He then had a week's holiday booked for early October, and the local, there's 2 or 3 little farm cottages at the top of the hill at Redmore, and in 2 of the cottages lived, these were tied cottages to the farm, and they were people in there that sort of were linked with Redmore. One was Dave Bufton and the other one was Eric Higgs. Now Eric Higgs became the sort of bailiff in the 70s, but early on, when Bob Richards was there and Walker, there was a tenant farmer. It was a right miserable so-and-so, and didn't like anglers, and made it, you know, altogether quite difficult for everybody early on. But obviously it got ironed out in the end. But young Eric Higgs, as he was in October 1951, I was guessing he'd probably be a 10-year-old or 11-year-old. He'd met or seen Bob Richards, because not many people fished there, and he was interested. You know, he lived in the little farm. He was the son of one of the farmhands. He came down and you know, he became friendly with Bob Richards, and Bob got him to, "Can yourself, I've got some time off next week, can you bait up these spots with bits of paste, you know, show him how to make bread paste, and just throw a dozen bits in this spot here and this spot here." So he baited up for him, and he arrived there on this fateful day. It was the 6th of October 1951. It was a what they call the little summer of St Luke, some of the country folk, where you get those soft days in October, and the carp would perhaps be on the prod, getting ready for possibly the bad weather of winter coming. And he started off in a place which became known as the Willow Pitch. It was a natural opening. It was very overgrown, the place, neglected. It was very heavy weed. And he caught a carp, and he lost one. And he thought, "I'll move over to the other side." He moved over walked along the dam and fished by the little boathouse. Nothing happened for an hour. I thought, "No, hang on, I'll go back to the other spot." Anyway, this time his float dipped away, and this time it didn't break him, didn't get stuck in the weeds. And Eric Higgs, home from school, rushed down to see him, and was at his side, was the only witness to when this monstrous fish suddenly appeared in front of them on the end of his line, right in the edge. And of course, again, his net was entirely inadequate. And he turned to Eric and said those fateful words, "Pass me the gaff." And the fish was dragged ashore. I think more than one attempt was made. Anyway, it was weighed on the platform scales at the big house, and it was 31¼ pounds. It had beaten the old record quite comfortably, which was 26 pounds. and the fish was taken on the bus home. Can you imagine that under your arm? A 31-pound cow on the bus. Oh, yeah, he took it home, showed it was displayed at a tackle shop. And, well, it was designated to be buried, but it was thrown on the coal heap or something like that. But anyway, BB got to hear of this. Obviously, he must have telephoned. There was no other way other than, I suppose, telegram. Of contacting him, and he said, look, you know, if you still got the fish, my friend Richard Walker is a first class chap that's setting up taxidermy fish, could you send it to him? And anyway, ultimately that's what happened, and Walker received the fish and it was set up and put in a glass case, and obviously Walker was saying, where the hell you know, and with that I mean, it's a long convoluted story, but with that Walker managed to get the first weekend of the 1952 season with his friend Pete Thomas, who's still alive. Pete caught the second largest carp after Bob Richards' fish, a 28-pound, 10-ounce mirror on that first visit. And they went several times. Walker went with other pals. Fished, I think he claimed 460 hours he fished at Redmore during 1952. He hooked and lost a number of fish, some which he thought were monstrous. He landed 5-6 pounders, stuff like that, until the evening of the 12th of September when he and Pete Thomas left again for Redmore. This is coming from Hitchin across country, obviously no motorways in those days. Quite a long tortuous route through Lechlade, eventually over to Herefordshire. Arrived in darkness, set up their little tent in the willow pitch. There was 3 rods out. We were experimenting with a pre-production Mark IV carp rod. Dick had his original one, and Pete had 2 rods out. Round 5 o'clock in the morning on the 13th of September, there was a bite on Dick's rod. So in the darkness he went out, picked up the rod, waited for the line to tighten. Struck hard, very, very dark. It was, he remembers he could only see the outline of the trees opposite, and you know, the curve of the rod. And the fish made a determined run from sort of left to right, and right, not that far away, was the dam and a tangled mess of alder roots. Well, you know, after the tree's been cut down, the roots were like a Medusa's hair in the water, and he knew if the fish got into there, whatever it was, it would probably tie him up and he'd lose it. So maximum pressure, with the corks bending under his, that's a good expression, with the corks bending under his hands, the rod locked round well past test curve. It stopped and shot into a wee bed, got stuck, and anyway made a zigzag path all the way back to close to the bank. With that, Pete turned on the big headlamp, and they saw, Pete says, oh, it's a common carp. And with that, it sort of suddenly righted the fish, got renewed energy, and shot from a position of maybe 15 foot out, shot straight into there under a bramble bush. And when I say a bramble bush, it's like a bramble bush that had grown and got crushed and the whole thing, and new growth on top. It's a real barrier in the water, if you like. It's hung over, and it crashed through there and got stuck. And of course, rods aren't made for things like that. It was difficult. With that, well, so the story goes, the hole that the fish made, Pete went out, laid on this bramble heap, put the large triangular net over the hole where it went, and felt down the line and sort of teased the fish, and it shot straight out into the net. And somehow or other, the pair of them managed to manhandle this big fish ashore, and then looked at it, and then of course the more I looked at it, Dick was saying, this is a mighty big carp. And the hook was only lightly lodged in the fish's mouth, and it came out quite easy. They then made a rough weigh-in, it was just getting light then, made a rough weigh-in on the bank with 2 sets of scales, and got a weight of 41.5 pounds, so they knew there and then that it was a new, by a considerable margin, a new record carp. And he sent a telegram to Bernard Venables to give you a timeline on it. The 13th of September was a Saturday in 1952, and it was the day of the All England match. And Ken Sutton, who was the founder of Angling Times, and Bernard Venables, who was then writing for the Daily Mirror on his famous Mr. Crabtree angling and fishing strip, simply said, caught carp, 41.5 pounds, blah, blah, blah. And then he sat from, so Pete says, he sat chain smoking outside the tent. Pete was inside, and in that period he vowed not to kill it. He's a very good photographer, Walker, and there's plenty of photos taken of the fish. He then thought, well, hang on, it's always been levelled at us, that we're fibbers, romancers, always gilding the lily on catching big fish. If I could prove to people that this was a physical, living monster fish, how could I do that? Didn't want to kill it, certainly. Came up with the idea of putting it in a zoo. He rang London Zoo, so I don't know how he out of a telephone directory in the big house, he went up to the Bonython Court, used the phone, rang up, and they said, he said, look, I've got a £40 carp here. If you'd like to come and collect it, send somebody to collect it, you can have it for the zoo. And, well, it's a famous story, and I'm sure it happened. I'm not disputing anything. But Walker claimed that the voice at the other end, who was obviously disbelieving, said, look, no, sorry, we've got a £14 carp. No, not a £14 carp, a £40 carp. And the guy sort of made some terse comments and wish people, hoaxers didn't ring up at the Saturday. And he said, look, you have to be quite firm with him. I've got a £40 carp here. If you want it for the zoo, you can come and get it. If not, I'll ring up Bristol Zoo, and I'm sure they'll be more than delighted with it. And if then they find out, your employers find out that you turned it down because you didn't believe me, and Bristol Zoo. So, no, I've no reason to disbelieve. It sounds a great story, but that's what he said happened. And later that day, a truck arrived with tubbing it, and yes, indeed, it was transported all the way back to the Regent's Park Zoo in London, and it was weighed on arrival, 44 pounds, which was obviously a different weight than recorded on the bank, but maybe with two sets of scales it wasn't the best way of doing it. Walker thought at first that the sack must have included the fish was wrapped in, but no, it confirmed that no, it wasn't. It was the true weight of 44 pounds. And it resided in there from 1952 to 1971 when it died. And one of my great claims to carp fishing fame, if you like, is that I was certainly the last carp angler, possibly the last fisherman ever to touch that fish alive. Because in January 1971 I went to the zoo, which was deserted. Nobody goes to zoos in the winter. I'd written beforehand, it was all above board, and asked if I could, see the head keeper or something like that, and I'd like, if possible, to view not from the front, actually view it from above, actually get a sort of really close look at this incredible fish. Now, if you just wind the clock back into the 50s, as a kid I went there, and many people listening to this, when I ask for a show of hands wherever I go around the country, inevitably a hand or two will go up. Do you ever see the record carp in London Zoo? What was record carp? And, people, well, I went with the school once, remember that? Certainly went with the school. We'd gone to the zoo, but obviously the aquarium was part of it, and I was transfixed by it. This damn thing was as big as me then. I've been about 6 or 7 years old. Went with Mum and Dad once or twice, I remember. And in January 1971, it was a young lady that escorted me around. And when I think about it now, with health and safety and all that, it was dodgy. When we went up above, there was narrow hazard walkways between. They were illuminated. This area above was in darkness. You can see where you're going. But they were sort of walkways, narrow walkways, and I remember going and following this girl carefully, along, until she said, "It's in this one here. Waggle your fingers, it'll come up." They say it'd been in captivity 19 years at that stage, and it was tame. And it came up and Clarissa sucked. The famous Clarissa, or original name Ravioli, we better say that. The popular name afterwards, it became Clarissa, but Walker and Thomas had named it Ravioli, one of the first fish ever, certainly carp, to be given a name. And yeah, Clarissa sucked my fingers and then sort of half laid on the surface with my right hand index finger. I remember rubbing it along the flank of the fish. It was a big thrill for me. It sounds a daft thing to say, but it was a big thrill. And for years afterwards, at slideshows, they used to come out with, you know, anybody want to touch this finger? Only as a giggle. And one night I was in Scunthorpe, Leeds, God, somewhere like that, heaving with people. I remember it was the winter and nobody could go fishing, we were all frozen. And I said this, and suddenly somebody said, yeah, can I touch it? And they came from the back of the hall with his wife, with a camera. You know, E.T., it was like something out of E.T. with this fella touching my finger and his wife taking a photograph. It was quite funny. So, yeah, and in the May that year, 1971, it died, and people blamed me. But it was nothing to do with me, I promise you. That was Walker's fish. I subsequently became quite enthralled with that particular carp. I have scales from the fish, one of very few that were ever taken from Clarissa. I have the rod that caught Clarissa, Walker's Mark IV #1. I have sort of all the pictures that were taken that day, not only on Walker's camera, but Pete Thomas took some on a little box brownie as well. So I became very enthralled, certainly after coming face to face with that fish. By the way, it appeared to me like to be an old man then. It had a concave belly, I remember that. It had a growth close to the nostril on the sort of gill plate, which looked quite nasty. And when I went down and looked at it, then from through the glass, we went down afterwards. It looked like an old man, you know. Yeah, so I thought then, I mean, God blimey, in 1971, my best fish was about 16 or 17 pound, and to me it looked like a 30 pounder then. When it died, it was 28 3/4 pounds, so it shrunk from 44 pounds down to 28 3/4. It was put in a glass case, very poorly set up, and you can still see it today in lanes of West Bromwich or somewhere around Birmingham area. I went to the shop once, I remember looking at it. It's not really a sight, the mighty Clarissa, that you want to see. And that set Walker on the road to, I don't know, I wouldn't say fortune, he never made anything of that, but certainly fame. And then he went on just to catch all these other amazing fish of all species, with an incredible catalogue of figures, including carp. Another thing worth mentioning, and in fact I've got to think long and hard if I can, certainly at that period there was anybody who held both the record and the second largest fish of any species at that stage, what Walker did. Because in 1954 he caught a 31 1/4 pounder, which was really 34 pound, but we won't go into that story. But all I'm saying is he headed the first and second in the carp record list, which I don't think anybody at the time had done. And here we are all these years later, and 40 pounders, though are much more common these days, they are still an absolute top thing for a carp angler to catch. I haven't caught one, not in this country, and I have fish waters with them in. It's not that I haven't, but one hasn't come my way, but it might be this year, who knows. I am next week going to a water that holds a number of 40 pounders, so you never know. I could either talk myself into one, or maybe I'll put the mockers on it by mentioning it.
You mentioned earlier the chap coming up from the back of one of your talks to touch the finger that had previously touched Clarissa, and also warning Walker's personal Mark IV carp rod. Now, I've actually handled that rod when you kindly brought it out of safe storage for me to look at and to film, and afterwards I had a similar experience to yours. Two people actually wanted to shake the hand that had held that rod, such as the esteemed Richard Walker is still held in today, and deservedly so.